weird name, but whatever. The objective is to describe the energy not transferred to higher trophic levels and the inefficiencies in the transfer of matter and energy. Number star indicates that a quick check question is being covered. And if you want to download this PowerPoint, you can in that file pod right below. Okay, so we've already started talking about this stuff about energy transfers not being efficient and 100%. And we've talked about the 10% rule, that only 10% of the energy stored at one trophic level, so the energy stored at one trophic level, can be stored at the next trophic level. And we have talked about that. Part of it is because the energy here is the organisms in one trophic level are using that energy for their own biochemical processes. And we'll look at some other reasons why in just a minute. But this is important too because it shows the importance of producers and needing a high number of producers or autotrophs. Remember, those terms are interchangeable, producer and autotroph. But the producers really need to support all the different consumers or heterotrophs. And that we can't have too many higher level consumers just based on the energy available for them. Now, a couple things that can also add to this besides organisms using the energy for their own biochemical processes is that not all organisms in one trophic level get consumed. So not all of these plankton are going to be consumed and be able to pass on their stored energy to the next level. Some of them are going to die and fall to the bottom of the ocean. Another reason why there's not 100%, another thing that adds to it, is that not all molecules are broken down by the consumer. So when you eat something, your body cannot break down every single molecule and get energy from every single thing. That's why you have to go to the bathroom, because the stuff that you can't break down, it gets exited and removed from your body. Okay, that's your waste, that's your poop. But decomposers can utilize these energy sources. So that's kind of what decomposers do. They can break down your waste. They can break down dead organic matter and release that energy and that stored matter, those nutrients, but they're not on this pyramid here. They're not like in a typical food chain. They're kind of added at the end. So they're not part of this 10% transfer. Now, a new idea that gets brought up, and it kind of is building on something you already know, is primary productivity. So the definition of primary productivity is the rate that plants and other photosynthetic organisms produce organic compounds. So when we're talking about primary productivity, we're just looking at producers. We're just looking at autotrophs. So this term and this concept does not apply to any of the heterotrophs. This does not apply to us. Okay? Now, primary productivity can be broken or talked about in two different things, GPP and MPP. They're fun to say. So GPP, gross primary productivity, is the total amount of energy that plants capture and assimilate in a given period of time. So we're still looking at like a certain amount of time, like a rate sort of thing, but the total amount is your gross amount. How much did you get total? Now, if you look at this image over here, we've got the sun, and it's showing us that really only 1% of solar energy actually gets captured by autotrophs, producers. The other 99% is used to warm the atmosphere. It gets, bounced and reflected back out into the space as well. So kind of crazy to think that only that small percentage is what gets captured and used by living things. But what actually gets captured and assimilated is GPP, the total amount. Now, NPP, net primary productivity, that represents the rate at which organic material is actually incorporated into the plant tissue for growth. So this is what is not being used by the plant to run its own biochemical processes. So remember, it's taking in that energy, but then it's using that energy for itself because it needs energy to live. The net primary productivity is what's left over. It's what's extra. So they can use that to build new cells, to grow. They can use that to make flowers if they're a flowering plant for reproduction. That is extra, stored energy. That NPP is, again, what plant growth is, what we can actually see, and it's what is available for food for other organisms. Okay, so the NPP is what the primary consumer has available to them because they can't use what has already been used. All right, so again, primary productivity, we're looking at how much, we're looking at how quickly organisms are producing organic materials, and those organic materials are the sugars. It's what is being created with that sun's energy. It now has, those organic materials now have the sun's energy in it. So the gross primary productivity is the total amount, all of the stuff that they're assimilating, putting into their, being able to capture. And then the net primary productivity is what's available for other organisms. It's what's used to grow and make them bigger, and that's what is available for other organisms to eat. I found this picture that I had. I was like, oh, hopefully maybe it'll show the relationship between gross and net and photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Remember, with photosynthesis, you're taking energy in, and this is the sun's energy. That's the sun's energy that's coming in, and then they're converting it to organic molecules, and this is chemical energy. Then that plant, and if you look down at this picture here, that plant produces it, but it also uses it itself. That plant needs to take that sugar and some oxygen to create ATP, which is the energy source their cells can use. So they take the chemical energy that they stored from the sun's energy and then break it down to make usable energy for their body. All right, so they make ATP. Then whatever's left over, other things can eat and then use those sugars to have energy for their bodies. So just a reminder, plants do cellular respiration as well. All right, your lesson has a section about measuring primary productivity, how people go about doing this. And it is something that gets measured, but it's grossly simplified in what is in your lesson. So let's see, your lesson says that GPP, so the total amount, is measured by how much oxygen is given off by a plant during photosynthesis. So how much oxygen is released. And oxygen is a waste product of photosynthesis. So, you can figure out how much oxygen and get an idea of how much organic molecules are made. But it doesn't take into account that the plant is using oxygen at the same time. So it's keeping some of that oxygen for itself, and only what is excess gets released. So your lesson does talk about how they measure how much oxygen is used during cellular respiration by observing plants in dark conditions, because plants in the dark are still doing cellular respiration because they still need energy, but there's not, and this is kind of what they do, but there's a lot of other things that they're doing, and they're ignoring the fact that maybe they're not doing as much cellular respiration at night as during the day, because ultimately what they're trying to do is figure out how much other oxygen is being produced during the day by figuring out how much oxygen they're using at night. So it's very simplified, but there is a quick check question about it, and really you just need to know that they're figuring out how much oxygen it's using in the dark, because that's when cellular respiration, when photosynthesis wouldn't be happening, and cellular respiration would be. But ultimately the idea is right, that we figure out NPP, the net, what's available for other organisms to eat, is GPP, so the total, minus how much organic material is used in respiration. So it's minus the energy and organic materials that are used by the plant. And they figure out the organic materials by figuring out the oxygen. So sometimes they'll say oxygen, sometimes it says organic materials. All right, this image shows the net primary productivity for different habitats, for different types of ecosystems. And the amount of net primary productivity can determine a bunch about an ecosystem. It can determine how many, like what type of food webs you can have. So here we have a desert ecosystem and a temperate forest ecosystem. And the number of producers, primary producers, is different. So the density is much higher in a temperate forest compared to a desert. So you have more plants, more producers. You're going to have more NPP happening in the temperate forest. And because of that, because you have more NPP, more energy available to consumers, heterotrophs, you can have more complex food webs. Whereas in a desert, you have a more simple food web system and you have few tertiary consumers. Another way you can look at this is with the coyote. Coyotes live in both of these systems, and you can have more coyotes in a temperate forest, or they could live off a smaller area compared to the desert. So it does have some application, some value. Another way that we look at NPP is at human consumption, which is not part of the lesson, but I'm just throwing it in there because I think it's interesting. If you look at human consumption of NPP, so that's what percent of NPP, you see in a lot of places that we're doing more, we're consuming more, eating more than 100%, which means we're taking it from other places, which means that it's not there, that energy is not there for other organisms. So this is not sustainable. All right, the next thing that gets brought up in your lessons is food chain pollution and how toxins in the food chain biomagnify. There's biomagnification of certain toxins, toxins that are created by bacteria, like red tide, that sort of stuff. DDT, which we'll talk about in a minute. Mercury is another one that biomagnifies. And what that means is that if you look at the concentration of these toxins in the lower parts of the food chain, so the producers and the primary consumers, there's a really small amount. But as you move up the food chain, it becomes, the concentration gets higher and higher. So ppm, parts per million, is a measure of concentration. And these are toxins that can't be broken down by living organisms, or at least most living organisms. So when a plankton, if it's in a plankton or a phytoplankton, they store that toxin. They can't break it down, so they'll just store it in their tissue, but it's in such a small concentration it doesn't affect them. But then the small fish will eat the zooplankton, and that toxin will start to build up in their tissue, but maybe it's still too small of a concentration to affect them and their lively processes, if you will, life processes. But once you start getting into these higher levels, the concentration can be so much that it does affect them. The classic example is with DDT, and this was a insecticide or a pesticide, and it killed insects. So insecticide is a type of pesticide that was used heavily in the 40s. Like we sprayed it on crops. In this picture, you can see they're spraying it. I don't know if it's like on a grassy area, but no one's wearing a mask or anything. Not concerned. This person here, that they're being treated with lice, and just spraying it all over her hair. No mask, no anything. No one's worried about it. Well, they started to get some concerns in the mid 40s, and in the 50s, there was actually a sharp decline in eagle populations, and eagles are predatory, top-level predator birds in some ecosystems. And in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote her infamous book, Silent Spring, and it was about DDT. It was about how this chemical was affecting our predatory bird populations, and not just birds, but reptiles and other organisms. So this chemical was biomagnifying in the food chain, and in certain concentrations, in high enough concentrations, it was affecting the eggs, making the eggshells of reptiles and birds very thin. And so the eggs wouldn't, the babies inside the eggs weren't able to develop and they were dying. And so populations were declining. So that in the early 60s, she wrote her book trying to bring awareness, make changes, and it wasn't banned until 73. And so you have never used DDT because it has been banned for many years now. But at the time, they were also, like when people were starting to get concerned about it, they were detecting it in women's breast milk. So, it could possibly have effects on humans, but none well-known ones that were documented. But there have been documentations of mercury affecting humans. Like if you ever want to look into Minamata's disease, that was mercury biomagnifying and affecting humans. The code word for this video is lice. The code word for this video is lice. So again, biomagnification, and this is images showing DDT and birds, but any of these chemicals that cannot be broken down by living things, they're biomagnifying, they're getting stored in the tissues, and that's what we do with a lot of toxins. Remember, you are what you eat. So if you're eating these fish, so these numbers are getting bigger and bigger. You can see the number here is getting bigger. So the concentration is increasing, and it increases to a point where it's affecting that organism. It's in the case of DDT, it's reproduction. In the case of mercury, it affects your brain, the neurotoxin. So that's one danger for top level consumers like ourselves.